Hi, I'm Heather Hubbard. I went from being a lawyer and partner at one of the largest firms in America to becoming an online personality and successful entrepreneur. I know what it takes to rise to the top. I also know all too well the toll it can take on your health and personal life. So, how do you shine bright without burning out? How do you chase joy while achieving success? You're listening to the Hustle and Flow podcast. So Kori and I have continued to have this conversation, and we have started to get into all kinds of topics. And we decided we were having a conversation that was so important that we needed to be talking about it, that we decided to get back on and hit record. So the topic is around allyship and the relationship between Black women and white women, and how after this election, that is a conversation that is more important now than ever, and one that we have to have. So as we were talking, Kori said she might have some questions for me, and I said, let's do it. So Kori, I'm gonna give you the microphone.
Yeah. So I actually think it's Black women, white women may be the symbol of this, but it's deeper, right? It's about allyship, and what does allyship look like? Sorry, I'm lowering my desk. What does allyship look like anymore? Because it feels like allyship, I've heard people say things like allyship is dead. And what they mean when they say allyship is dead is that I don't know who to trust, right? I'm looking at these numbers and it doesn't feel like I can trust that we're aligned, right? That you made decisions for whatever reasons you made. You can say it was economy, you can say whatever it was, but at the end of the day, that decision also supports a platform that is inconsistent with allyship when it comes to gender equity or racial equity or whatever, trans equity, LGBTQ plus equity. And those numbers are huge, right? And
Huge.
and some of what we're seeing in this post-election is a lot of finger pointing. Like people want to talk about the percentage of Black men, but yet still, if you look at those numbers, if you look at the percentage of the population, that's not what swung it. That's not what swung it. And frankly, Black men were just right behind the 92% of Black women. And
Mm-hmm.
so, in the United States at least, this distrust has always been there, dating back to slavery, where Black women have not necessarily felt like we could just automatically trust white women and say, just because we're women, I can believe we're aligned. And you and I both know there has been a lot of racism in the feminist movement. It's why
Absolutely.
there's this whole other dynamic of womanism, even up to the suffragette movement. We saw
Yeah.
the ways in which racism plays such a blatant role. And so the question is, here we are now, right? Some 52% of white women voted in ways very different than 92% of Black women,
Right.
majority of Latinas and other communities of color. But even then, we saw other differences between Latino populations and Asian American populations. So the question for you, Heather, is as someone who does this work, you do this work.
Mm-hmm.
Um, you are so intentional, right? Every retreat and every program of yours that you do, you make sure that there's diversity there. When you host a program, like you make equity and inclusion just part of what you do and part of your values. So I know you, and I have women like you in my life. Some of my soul sisters are people who look like you. But how do we bridge this in terms of allyship? Because there are many people who look like me, and we're just not trying to take our chances
Mm-hmm.
to figure out whether the white women out there are allies like you or not?
Well, I mean, I don't think it's the obligation of Black women to figure that out. And I think that as white women, we have shown over and over and over again that you should not trust us. And
Mm.
so for me, I think it's really about white women who say they are allies really showing up in ways that are. I so I was having a few different conversations. I mean, the one thing which I mean, I think Black women know this, maybe not in the same way. Um, it's like, God damn, like white women, like, I would love to have community and the concept that families can come together and communities can come together and we all rally behind each other when frankly most of my life I have had conflict with other white women when we have conversations around feminism or racism.
Hmm.
And it's so rooted in our church. It's interesting. This is kind
Mm.
of like a whole other conversation, but I have always found it interesting how some Black women are so rooted in the church. And for me, the church represented misogyny and racism. And so I'm like, that's a
Mm.
different church. We're using the same name, right? We're using the
Yes.
same words. And yet my experience looked very different. And so the concept of just being able to have conversations and to get people to come around, especially if they love you and respect you, I've never experienced that. And so it's very frustrating when I feel as though I can't deliver the white woman vote.
Hmm.
And I do think sometimes there's a concept of we're not having conversations when I think a lot of us are. And yet we cannot have impact. We are not having the impact we want. And so going back to those, how how do we attack, how do we do this strategy differently? And the only people who know that are white women. These are our community, these are our people, and we don't have a good track record for those of us who truly are trying to make a difference. And it can feel really frustrating and infuriating as to, well, what is the strategy that's going to make a difference? And that's where I feel like a lot of us feel like we don't have the answers
Hmm.
because we've not been able to do it thus far. And so much of it, of course, is systematic because it is rooted in our churches, it is rooted in the family dynamics and the way that we are raised and all of that. And yet, I still believe that there is hope and that people can change. And
Mm-hmm.
so what does that look like? Um, and I don't even know if I'm answering your question, but I feel like for white women, there are a lot of white women who do perceive themselves as allies,
Mm-hmm.
but will not put themselves on the line, who
Mm.
will not look around and say, what do my friend circles look like? What do my clients look like? The programs I am participating in, what does that look like? Am I speaking up in rooms or am I speaking behind closed doors? Right. So if you're only speaking behind closed doors and supporting people when you don't actually have much on the line, that is a very passive allyship. I would argue that's not actually allyship at all. Um, but I do know that there's a lot of women out there who do identify as allies, but they don't have the courage to be
Yeah.
honest with themselves
Yeah.
about their role. And I don't think they have the courage to speak up when they have something on the line. And that's really where I think the work is to be done. And that's within us. That's amongst us. I also
Right.
had a lot
So
of
so there needs to be
yeah,
conversations amongst you all, right? Yeah.
yes. And they
And can you
and
actually
these
be an
conversations
ally?
do happen. What was that?
No, you finish. You finish.
I was just going to say, these conversations do happen.
Hmm.
They're they're interesting. I also feel like so when we, especially when we're talking about this election, part of it was because we're never really surprised by these numbers. But I think for me, what was most surprising was the number of people who simply did not show up to vote.
Yes.
Right. So those percentages of the people who were not going to change their minds. Like, that's not as surprising. But the people who, again, claim to be allies that did not show up to vote, that's where my confusion lies. And, obviously it looks different as a Black woman versus a white woman. But the very next day, the conversation I was having with my husband was, there's a whole lot of fucking liars out there. People who have been lying to my face, and I don't know who they are. And it reminded me a little bit of the SNL skit after 2016 where, all the white women were like, who's the bad guy? Who's the good guy? And the Black people were like, we've been doing this forever. Right. And
Mhm.
how do you know?
Mhm.
But how do you not show up and vote?
Mhm.
And what was
Mhm.
that about? And there
Mhm.
definitely was a group who were saying they were not voting because of the Palestinian conflict. But I don't think that was the sole reason.
No.
And that's where I feel like we really have to dig deep. How do you say you're an ally? How do you say these are things you care about and then you just don't vote?
So let's take it a little bit away from the politics and make it
Okay.
every day.
Yep.
So I've been in law firms, inside of law firms 22 years, working with law firms 24 years. The entire time I've been a lawyer, I've always been law firm focused. I never had the privilege of working for the government or doing human rights law like I planned or working for a corporation. So it's always been law firm focused. Um, and what I have seen my entire career is this same dynamic outside of
Mm.
politics, the same dynamic within the organization, right? Where we say we're focused on gender equity. We have the Women's Initiative, but the Women's Initiative is not inclusive and it is
Right.
not intersectional. And we might as well call it the White Women's Initiative. And a lot of women of color are not active or participate. And then we wonder why. And so, beyond the election,
Hmm.
this shows up in day to day,
Yes.
where, yes, we're all for women. Oh, except mm, when race comes in, there's a hierarchy. When some of these other issues, other intersectionalities come in, there's a hierarchy, right? And
Yes.
so I see this as beyond just the politics,
Yeah.
but even just in the day to day. And trust is at an all-time low, just generally.
Hmm.
Trust of institution, trust of leadership. And I can't imagine how this dynamic now will continue to impact teams in day to day. Do you think you'll see some of this in the work that you do in your masterminds and with your retreats in helping people lead and be more effective? Because we still got to be in community with each other.
Yeah. It's interesting. I don't know how it will show up. Um, Obviously, I do think there will be a difference and it will be worth having that conversation. Um, what's interesting is, and I guess this is for white women who actually care and want to make a difference. I recall having a mastermind with only white women. And when we started that meeting, we were in person at a retreat. And I think someone had said, "Oh, this is this is exciting. Are you really excited about the group, whatever else?" And I said, "I'm really excited about everyone who is here, but it's very obvious to me that I failed in making this an inclusive group because we are
Mm,
all white women."
mm,
And they were like, "But it's not that you didn't try." And I'm like, "And yet that's not the marker of success for me, right? The marker of success
mm,
in is this an inclusive group is what does the makeup of the group look like?" And
mhm,
so I then got very intentional about looking at, well, why is this not a diverse group? And how can I change that? And so I feel like for women, right? Like in your day-to-day life, whatever else, as a white woman. So, and I'm not saying that I have this right? Like I make mistakes and learn things every single day. But I do think that if you're committed to the work, you have to constantly look around you and ask, does my community, does my client base, does my colleagues, like, right? Like, or let me change my, do my colleagues, do my clients, do my friends, like, do these circles reflect what I
Mhm.
say I want to see in the world? And if they
Mhm.
don't, you got to look within
Mhm.
first and foremost, right?
Mhm. Mhm.
And I think that's how we start to bridge the gap.
Mhm.
Like, it's not a matter of like, how do Black women trust white women? In my mind, it's how do white women start acting and behaving and thinking in a way that deserves the trust of Black women? Like, that's
Mhm.
really at the core of what it is. And so
Yeah.
I do speak with a lot of white women, though, who say they're committed to anti racist work, but I don't actually see them doing things that look anti racist to me.
Mm, mm.
And I think anti racism is more than just a thought and more than just
Absolutely.
a state and more than just a statement.
Just like
And
allyship.
that's where I feel like we have a disconnect right now.
Yeah. Yeah. So I'll tell you a story. I was traveling around the time that the fallout came, when Dobbs came and Roe v. Wade was overturned, which I know was very upsetting to a lot of women across the political spectrum. And this is an example of this issue that we're talking about. I think this person is based in London, but after Dobbs happened, just like every time, issues around gender in the last 8 years have come up, people love to post the memes with the handmaid's tale, right?
Mm,
From Margaret Atwood's book.
yep.
The red gowns, the white hats, and people have even gone marching in those. And so, what this person was writing was essentially explaining two things. That one, it's quite unfortunate that women of color, especially Black women, women who are disabled, queer women, have been raising alarms about the infringements on women and the direction that things were going. And it took this decision for a lot of people to wake up, for a lot of
Mm,
white women to wake up, right? Which we see that with every society. When the infringements of rights begin, there's always this, oh, it won't affect us until it comes. We see that in Germany, Nazi Germany. Things begin happening. It's like the Niemöller poem. First they came for the trade unionists, and first they came for, it's like, oh, and then all of a sudden it's like, whoa, what's happening? By the time people start paying attention, it's too late. And so that was one of the points that she was making is, this is a problem. And then the second point that she was making is that people don't realize this, but that Handmaid's Tale meme, first of all, many of you think it's dystopian. It's actually based on the experiences of Black women in America. She looked
right.
to history. She looked to how Black women have been treated. And so this meme, eh, right? Now,
Yep.
if you truly were intersectional, if your feminism really was inclusive and you were white, you would look at that and go, ouch, but I need to sit with this,
Hmm.
right? Maybe uncomfortable, maybe something you hadn't heard before, maybe something you hadn't thought of before. But here, Black women raising this perspective, and you go, ouch. So I'll tell you what happened. I was traveling. I saw that. I didn't have time to write my own post because I had some thoughts. But I think I either shared that or commented on it. I can't remember, but I may have shared it. You want to know what happened? There were a bunch of people who were pissed off. White women pissed off, wanted me to take that down. And I thought, this is exactly what we're talking about. You care about gender equity. You care about the impact of this Dobbs decision, but not if you have to listen to a Black woman explain how these voices have been raising concerns and they were not listened to, and not if you have to recognize the
Mm-hmm.
problem with this meme.
Mm-hmm.
So we're all for gender equity, but we need to silence the Black woman. And these are the dynamics that happen in workplaces. Now,
Mm-hmm.
do you think I would ever look at those people ever the same way again?
No.
Never. Because I'm like, your gender equity has caveats,
Correct. Yeah.
right? Yeah. And that's
I
just one
think
example. We see so many others.
I think white women have always centered themselves and continue to center themselves. I mean, I will notice when I center myself, right? Sometimes in the moment and sometimes later. But it is so inherent in systemic racism, right? It's so inherent again in our churches in the way that we're raised that you have to intentionally work at deconstructing that.
Hmm.
And so that's where a lot of white women think they are supportive, but in their actions, they're not. And I think part of that is because white women are not in spaces to learn, right? A lot of white women are in spaces to lead and
Hmm.
not in spaces to learn. And I constantly try to seek out people of color, especially Black women, to teach. And not just to teach on DEI issues, right? Because I think that's a
Yes.
common,
And that's a
but to
failure too. Yeah.
truly seek out Black women to teach on all kinds of subjects, right? So
Hmm.
you're so that your mentors are not just white women. And it's these little things that, right, it may not be conscious, the way that we're thinking, but when we think that once like we will get this and then we'll bring people up, I mean that is racism, right? Like that is classism.
Yeah.
And and that's it all just goes back to not just how this, I mean, this country was founded, but I do think we have a particular set of issues in this country because of how slavery was such a part of how we were founded and how capitalism started and everything with that. But just knowing that all of our power has been rooted in white supremacy.
Mm-hmm.
Like it again, it's not just a thought.
Hmm.
You have to put forth work and effort and action, and
Hmm.
it does not feel good.
Hmm. So when you finally air this, there are going to be people who will watch this and they will be pissed. And they will say, Heather and Kori just got on and started bagging on white women, right? And most of them are going to have no idea what our personal circles look like and just how
Mhm,
diverse they are. Um, so the real question is, from woman to woman,
mhm.
what do you say to them to get them to the table to say, this is important enough that we need to face this and we need to do better?
This is such a good question, Corey, and this is where I feel like I fail all the time, right? Because I wanna get
Hmm.
on my high horse and be like, "What the fuck is your problem?" Which is not effective. Um, this is actually a really interesting conversation. I'm probably not answering your question at all, but I'm just trying to be vulnerable and honest in this. I feel like,
Please.
how do you not care? Like, this is always my thing,
Mhm.
right? I'm just like, how can we not care about everyone? And
Mhm.
how can we not want everyone to be centered in the conversation? How can we put
Mhm.
ourselves above others? Like, I get like we're going to do it, but how can we not want to stop putting ourselves above others?
Mhm.
And for me, I've always struggled with if you can't change a heart, then how do you get there? And
Mhm.
so I'm curious from your perspective,
Mhm.
do you think there's like, is there a more effective, is there a better way to actually go about that conversation? Because I am terrible at it.
Mhm. I think part of what has to happen in all change is there has to be a sense of urgency and something that people connect around, right? Like, gosh, there's this thing I desire that we all want, and we want to center around it, and it's urgent. And I don't know what that is, but it also, the process of unlearning in order to relearn is very hard. And it can be very defensive because the first time you come across information that is completely contrary to everything that you've believed, you're defensive,
Mm-hmm.
right? The starting point for this is acknowledging that white supremacy is real and that you, as a white woman, benefit from it.
Mm-hmm.
And many white women, because of their struggle for gender equity, are very much believing that they're in the same place. In fact, some white women I've had even say to me, they feel like black men have it better than them, right? And so I see your face. No, but there are people who will say that. They will argue it vehemently, right?
Yeah.
Um, and it's not new. I mean, some of those women in the suffragette movement actually made that argument. Like
Oh
they
yeah.
were appalled at the idea that black men would have any rights before them. So that's the first hurdle that you reach, right? Is that you are asking somebody to confront and unlearn something that they've always believed and never attached any ill conclusion. Ill conclusion is not the right word. A negative word belief to that belief, right? So
Mm-hmm.
now that's where you're starting from. And it seems to me that the first thing that you have to do, going back to our other conversation, is you got to come connect on the commonality and then begin to show where it's different. You got to bring education to where here's where I agree with you, but do you see the ways in which what you believe may not be accurate? And you bring that knowledge in, and there has to be elements of trust.
Mm-hmm.
Why would I listen to you? If I was a white woman, why would I listen to you? Why would I listen to you? What is it that you have to share that would make me question what I've always believed? And
Mm-hmm.
education has to be a big part of it too, right? The more we know, I mean, there are times that we learn things and we're like, oh, wow, I did not know that. And that's a big part of this. I think the lack of in-depth education about the level of atrocities and oppression is intent. It's intentional. It's not an accident.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's why they don't want our children learning the true history, because when they learn, the kids are like, whoa, what? We got to fix that. We got to do better.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. I mean, this current push to actually take Black history, it's not Black history, it's American history,
It's
to take,
American history. Yeah.
yeah, to
Yeah.
take American history out of the books so that white kids don't feel uncomfortable, right? Or to question anything. Uh, it's like that goes beyond not wanting to question it. It that like right? Like I mean that is you are firmly wanting to support this belief, this oppression. And I guess as you were mentioning earlier, that is a different conversation. That's a person that you're not going to be able to convince. Although it's so interesting when I just think of my own circles and my own upbringing. In another, I was thinking of when you were talking about white women versus Black men. I grew up in rural Kentucky, in areas of Appalachia where there's a lot of poverty. And
Hmm.
so also this belief that well, I've not had anything, and because I am poor, right? Like that somehow my experience is the same as or
Yeah.
worse than
Yeah.
Black people, even though there aren't very many Black people there. So it's just what they're hearing. They don't actually, right? Um,
Yeah.
but it's another one of those like us versus them of who is suffering the most and who is going to
Yeah.
have harm. And going back to anytime you give, something is being taken away, as opposed to being able to say, no, it's not a matter of, 100 and how is this pie getting split up? And yet that is so firmly rooted in families and traditions and schools and churches that it is a very difficult conversation.
It
A lot of
is.
times growing up, when I would have these conversations, some people were open to having them and learning as I learned and I would share. They were interested in learning, and others were not open to having the discussion at all. And we would just fight. And then, especially with Trump, there then became the we just won't talk. We just won't be around each other. And that's the interesting middle part, right? So that they're not the staunch, we're going to argue about this, but they're
Mm-hmm.
also not willing to be open and curious and have a conversation.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the group where it's like, okay, I feel like maybe there's still a difference to be made, and yet I don't know how
Yeah.
to do it.
Yeah. Well, I think those people definitely need to feel like you see them and you hear them and you
Mm,
understand their struggles. Because I
mhm,
think there are a large group of people who feel like they're not seen, even though they are, but somehow we have failed to communicate to them that we see them.
mhm,
I think it's interesting that I personally think that the people that they feel don't see them are actually the ones who have policies that would help them, but somehow have not effectively communicated that to them, uh,
right.
because they feel condescended to, which, I'm thinking in your dynamic of what you just explained, we see all this research that people feel like when their families go off to college and get educated, they think they're better than. And it's
Mhm,
not that at all. I also think it's interesting that you, who grew up with them and grew up in that environment and found a way out, have less credibility than some billionaire who grew up with a silver spoon and has nothing in common with them. And so
but he
human
says what they wanna
psychology,
hear. He
yeah, it's
validates them,
right.
and
It's
I'm
all
not validating.
right, right. But it's all these dynamics that they're complex and they're hard to navigate. But you have to figure out how to do that within our own communities, and with our own people to a certain extent, and then also know when it is healthy to say, I'm just cutting this off.
Mhm,
This is not healthy, this is toxic, or this is degrading, especially sometimes when you have family. Like, I completely understand. I have close family friends. If they have you have a trans kid and the family's transphobic and is spouting views that are, I mean, it's harmful. At some point you got to recognize when it's harmful to those in your family who you are entrusted with protecting.
right.
um and so, yeah, it's hard. It's hard. I acknowledge that it's hard, it's not easy.
And yet we still have to do it. This goes back to the courageous leadership conversation, right?
Yeah.
But I do think, and again, this is a white person problem. It impacts Black people, right? It doesn't really impact white people. Um, but navigating what it looks like to truly be an ally within a family dynamic that either are passive or they are outright racist and may even claim to be. That's not the word they're going to use, but I feel like it is. I think in many ways, and I'm not saying that I've done it the right way. I'm constantly questioning it because for me, it's like, well, if Black bodies are still being harmed, then
Mm,
I'm not trying hard enough. I still have to find another way. But
Mm.
I have cut off a lot of relationships where I have said, I will not be in this room if you are going to use those words. And
Because it's inconsistent with your values.
correct.
Yeah.
And I do think that the vast majority of white people just look away
Hmm.
because they don't want to rock the boat. And within the family dynamic, they don't know how to live into their values. And
And
I will
also,
say,
there isn't the sense of urgency.
correct, correct. So I
Because
do
I think
think,
for some people, it's just politics. I think
yeah,
there isn't a lack of recognition of the human cost, right? In the ways that we were just talking about.
hmm, yeah. And I've definitely gotten in fights where, because right, you start talking about people you know and trying to give examples, and it becomes a fight, and you walk away thinking, you're just so angry and frustrated with the whole situation. And then sometimes those people will either come back or not come back, but then say something later where it's like, oh, you actually got through to them. Like in the moment, there was no reflection of that, but perhaps they sat with it. And I do think that so I suspect, I could be wrong, that we actually won't have a lot of white women listening who are outraged because I don't think that those people listen to me. But I do think that there will be a lot of white women who listen to this who feel like they're being poked. And I
Mhm.
would say to them that if you are feeling a little uncomfortable with this conversation, if you feel like you're being poked a little bit, that's an opportunity to lean in and ask yourself why you are not showing up when you could be, what you're afraid of losing, and why you're not willing to lose that. And if the reason why you're not willing to lose that is because of protectionism of yourself, just really sitting with how that is a form of white supremacy and classism. And I think that most of us, when we really do care and we can sit with that and recognize that, we have to work through that, and we will work through that. And I do think that that's where there is an opportunity for people listening to know that, like, I guess the question would be for the white women listening is, are you someone a black woman should trust?
Hmm.
What are the actions you're taking?
Mhm.
How
I
committed to
used to
these
love to
working?
ask, as part of inclusive leadership development, I'd ask people, are you sponsoring, do you sponsor people who are different from you? And always interested to see when, for example, a white woman will say, oh, yeah, I sponsor a woman of color. And then I talk to those women of color and ask, do you consider this person your sponsor? And just see what the differences are.
Mm,
Because part of the problem is there are a lot of people who show up. You use the phrase call themselves allies. And I love that because there's a difference between you naming yourself an ally and other people saying you are an ally.
mhm.
Those are two different things. And we really shouldn't be technically calling ourselves allies. We should be thinking of ourselves as striving to be allies or being committed to being allies. But the people from the group that we claim to be allies to have to recognize us as allies and name us as allies because otherwise we're failing. But that's a separate conversation.
Mhm.
Um, and I think sometimes that oftentimes there is that gap, right? Because some of these people that we are talking about here today, they genuinely believe that they're doing the work and they will say that they're committed. And
Yep.
oftentimes, when you call them or call them in that they are centering or that they are taking positions that are racist, they would be very defensive.
Yeah.
And so it's hard. It's hard to look in the mirror. It's hard to look in the mirror. But
Mhm. I will say, I one of the things that I try to do, if this is helpful for others who are listening, anytime I feel called in or questioned, I have a rule that I don't speak,
mm,
but to say, thank you for sharing that with me.
mm,
Because
mm,
if I'm being called in or questioned, there's something I've not looked at and I can't look at it in the moment. Right. Like, I need to go be with myself and truly look at it.
Yes.
And that has helped me because I do think it's easy to, like, when you feel called in or questioned, you might feel embarrassed, you might feel
Yes.
guilty, you might feel
Yes.
ashamed,
Yes.
and it's really hard to actually be able to look at stuff when you're coming from that reactive, emotionally triggered place. And so just trying to be open to, if I'm being called in and questioned and I'm willing to create space around it, that lets me know I'm still committed to the work. I think if you never get called in and questioned, you might, I mean, part of it could be the groups you're hanging around, but you might realize that people don't actually trust you,
Mm,
because I feel as though people are willing to call me out and question me because they trust that I'm doing the work. Right? Like if I'm never being called in or questioned, then the story I tell myself is people don't trust me enough to call me out.
mm, mm, mm. Something else that occurred to me, I like that, Heather. That's a very humility centered approach. And also an approach that is centered in you want to get it right. Right? You want to do right. You want to Are you an Enneagram 1 like me by any chance?
Of course.
Yes, yes, yes. We want to get it right. We want to do it right. Getting things right are very important to us. Is very important to us. But something else that I think, with regard to this getting it right, that I think I know impacts the whole being able to win hearts and minds is being very clear about what your intent is. When you engage with those relatives or people in your community or people you disagree with, or even people at work that you're trying to win over, what is your intent?
Mm,
Is your intent to understand so that you can build a strategy? Is your intent to educate? In which case, I need to figure out what will resonate best with you, right? Because one tool, you can't use the same tool for everything, right?
mm,
Just like everything else I'm doing in an organization, if I'm working with someone and data is what moves them, I'm gonna give you data. If what works best for you is qualitative data, the human stories, the experiences, that's what I'm gonna give you. Now, of course, I'm a lawyer, so we're trained to do this. We're always thinking about how we can be strategic. But when it comes to these things, we oftentimes are not strategic, right? Like there's an emotional reaction to the idea that we may need to sit down with people who are so opposed to us, who have offensive views, and make space to listen to them. There's a visceral reaction because why should I? I'm on the receiving end of this. And I got to listen to your fears. As someone in the majority, someone with the privilege, I got to listen to your fears. But when my kid was 4 and my kid would have a meltdown, I didn't just have a one size fits all like my parents' generation did about how kids should behave and they're not being disciplined enough. And that clearly is a kid who doesn't get spanked because otherwise, no, I would, is she hungry? Is she tired? Because if my kid is tired and they're hungry and that's why they're behaving the way that they do, doesn't that then dictate my next steps? It does. When we're
yeah.
litigating cases and we do our fact investigation and then we use that to build our strategy, why are we doing that? Because we just don't build strategy and we just don't approach things without understanding the drivers and what's going on. It's the same way when we're engaging with people and we want to understand their perspectives. It's not because we want to say this perspective is the same as this perspective, but is to say, if I'm going to move forward with you, I need to understand where you're coming from because that's going to dictate what I do. In the same way, so many times when we engage with people, we engage and we want to be right and we want to win the argument.
Hmm.
But if we're engaging, no, I want to understand because I want to persuade you. I want to add to your information bank. Here is something you may not have considered. That changes how we approach people and it changes how we approach the discussion. And even when it is visceral, where somebody says something that is so offensive, you can at least have the space to go, ouch. I want to give space for this, but this thing that you've said, it lands so hard. But you know what? You're not going to listen to me, Heather, say, wow, I don't know if you realize that this thing that you said lands so wrong because it really it's rooted in this belief that people like me are less than. You're not going to make space to listen to that if I haven't made space to listen to you. And now
Mm,
we can do the whole thing of who goes first. Absolutely. We could. And I definitely should not engage in that conversation with you if I'm in an emotional place where anything you say may make me go, you know what? F you. I probably shouldn't engage in that conversation if that's where I am. And if that's where you are, that is absolutely fair. I think it's reasonable and fair if you're in that place. Um, but I do think that that's part of the dynamic. When we talk about
Mhm,
how do we engage with people, how do we do it? I think you got to be very clear about what your goals are. Is my
mm,
goal to win? Is my goal to prove a point? Or is my goal to move you towards where I want you to go? And if that's my goal, then my strategy needs to be informed by that. My approach needs to be informed by that. My tactics need to be informed by that.
mhm.
We should,
Yeah,
we got to get clear with ourselves on what that is. What am I doing here? What is my goal? And for some of us, our goal is I'm not trying to win over any hearts. That's okay.
that is definitely where I have so much opportunity to grow, and I do feel like in so many ways, as white women, we have the opportunity, like, we have that connection and that influence with we may not feel like we have influence, but we have that connection, right, with so many people who are also white in our communities, and being able to hold that space, especially when because especially if right, if we're talking about race and not sex, then I may be offended by what you're saying, but I am not directly harmed.
Hmm.
And when a black person or another person of color is having to bring this up to a white person and that statement is made, there is harm. And that's where I do think, myself included, there's just a lot of work around the resiliency. And when you were sharing, like, what's the ultimate goal here? I really do think as white women, we have to dig into that and reframe that and work really, really hard on, is it just me being right? Is it me winning? Is it me
Yeah.
trying to make a difference? Or is it me truly caring enough about how others are impacted such that I am willing to withstand conversations I don't like if there can be, right? Like, if we think there can be influence, and to lean into that discomfort and really be strategic so that we have the effect we're reaching for. Because I
Hmm.
do think that it's really easy for us to center our feelings and need to be right, which allows us to kind of put ourselves on a pedestal, right? Like, we're
Yes.
the good ones. We're the good
Yes.
ones.
Yes.
Um, when if it's not affecting change, then we're just kind of on our high horse, really. And that's
Right.
that's where I know I personally have a lot of room for growth.
Yeah. Well, it's uncomfortable for everyone, so don't beat yourself up. I think most of us, there's a reason why nationally as a country, um, we're very divided and we're very siloed, and everybody is only, not everybody, but people are generally just talking to other people who believe what they believe.
Yes.
Confirmation bias. I mean, we have
Yes.
studies coming out talking about why facts are not persuading people. But I think it's even worse than that. I think it's not just that facts aren't persuading people, it's that fake facts and fake news and disinformation is really, really persuading people. And how do you combat that? So that's part of
Right.
the problem. When you want to enter dialogue and you want to bring education, you're actually working against
Mhm.
misinformation,
Yes.
right? How do you convince someone who believes that teachers are in classrooms taking kids to nurses to turn them trans, right?
Yeah.
um where do you even begin?
Right.
Where do you even begin? And so there's a lot of work to be done. There's a lot of pieces there are things that the way our country is structured make it hard to deal with. How do you deal with misinformation and disinformation in a country that prizes free speech so much, that
Hmm.
sees any kind of regulation as censorship? You know, that's hard. If we were not a country that had that culture, it would be different. You know, it would be different, but we do. We saw that when Facebook and other social media platforms tried to do something during the election about misinformation, 4 years ago. A lot of people just lost their shit.
Yeah.
They lost it. They were like, "Oh my God, you're censoring us. You're silencing us." Da, 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 da. Those same people right now are quiet about all the silencing and censoring of diversity, equity, and inclusion education and training and history,
Right.
but they were upset. And so it's hard to navigate, the way our laws were created. Our laws are very behind the state of technology and the way technology is being used.
Hmm.
The creation of deep fakes and
Hmm.
all of those things that we are dealing with right now that have played a huge role in the propaganda machine. Our laws right now are not set up to combat that.
Yeah.
We're just assuming that put all the information out there and people will figure it out. But you know what? People aren't figuring it out.
No, they're not. I mean, you look at TikTok, right? And like some of the really big influencers there, especially like truly like these misogynist white male supremacists and the disinformation and in many ways the grooming that is happening with young white men and women, right? Especially like white women, like seeing that and it's just like how do you even combat that? And yeah,
That's a whole other issue.
that's a whole
And
other oof. Um,
yeah,
but I do think
oh, go ahead.
no, I was just gonna say, but I do think that there are differences to be made.
Yes.
And it's easy to think that, right? Like that's what we have. Like we're just so far apart that there's no middle ground. And I appreciate, especially like in the first part of the conversation, saying the goal now is finding where do we bridge the gap. The goal now is how do we find those people who don't speak up, who don't vote, who identify as an ally but aren't actually taking action that supports that. That's really, I think, where the opportunity lies.
Hmm.
And I do think similar to what we were talking about with like where's your proximity, that I may not be able to influence someone who is being influenced by TikTok, but someone that I can, right? Like it kind of just moves sideways. I don't
Your
want to say up and
circle.
down, but let's say
Yeah.
sideways, right?
Yeah.
That the person that I might be able to impact may be able to impact influence someone else.
That's
And
right.
so to think that there's nothing we can do and the feeling of helplessness and hopelessness, which I think we can all experience at times, is not real because I do think that there are a lot of people who want to make a difference and think they're making a difference, but there's so much more opportunity for them to really step up to the plate. Myself include all of us, right? Like we all have room for growth. And if we can lean into that, perhaps we can make a bigger difference. And I suspect everyone listening can identify and resonate with the fact that we have started to surround ourselves with like-minded people. And even in the right, like we don't get on phone calls anymore, right? We text message. I do think we're living in an era where true connection and true conversations feel uncomfortable to us because we're not doing them regularly. And so just being able to lean into that and have
Hmm.
conversations with people again, especially when they don't agree on everything,
Hmm.
there might be a lot of opportunity there for us
Well, and
to
I think there are
make a
also
difference.
people who think that they can't do anything who can.
Mhm.
And I think everybody can. I think if we all took a step back and said, what is my circle of influence? And made the circles within family, within teams, within the organization, within my community, extra, right? Where am I being intentional about my influence versus accidental? Where am I being intentional about how I show up and how I interact and how I lead? Because we all are leaders. We all have the ability to influence the experiences of other people. And then if we took inventory and said, what are my skills? What are my talents? What are my gifts? What am I passionate about? And how can I use those things for influence? For some people, your circle of influence right now is parenting and on the PTA and in the carpool that you drive, right? You are impacting that generation of people around you. For some of you, it is in your church community, it is on your prayer team, it is in your mosque, it is in your synagogue, right? For some of you, that circle is the team that you lead and how you lead inclusively, regardless of what's going on in the organization, that models the kind of behavior that everybody else wants to be. Where you are intentional about recognizing and interrupting bias. You are intentional about developing people across differences. You're intentional about sponsoring. You're intentional about giving feedback in equitable, inclusive ways, such that it is being multiplied around you, because as the leader goes, so does the team, so does the organization. And some of us have skills and talents that are different. Maybe you're an artist, and the way you're influencing and the way you're advocating is through your poetry or through your music or through your paintings or through your art. And maybe you're an orator, and part of how you are influencing and advocating is through public communication or it's through speeches. The failure that we all have is that we think that there is one way. We look at what Heather does and what Heather has talked about on this podcast, and you think, I can't do that, so therefore I can't do anything. Or you look at Kori and you say, I can't do a TEDx, so therefore I can't do anything. I'm not a DEI leader, so I can't do anything. I'm not a civil rights lawyer, so I can't do anything. But it's not true. We each can do something, and the way it looks is going to be specific to how you were uniquely wired, what is authentic for you, what are your gifts, what are your talents, how do you connect with people. And we each have to find that unique way and go out and make a difference, but don't stand on the sidelines.
That was so powerful. I mean, I feel like I feel like that was it. I don't know if there's anything else you want to share, but I feel like that really is it. We can all make a difference, and we
Yeah.
have to find a way to do it in our own way.
Yeah.
But it's never passive. It is never passive.
It's never passive. Never
We
passive.
we all have an opportunity to be more courageous.
Yeah. Every day, multiple times a day.
Kori, thank you again. And I wanted to say thank you for, as we were chatting, you were like, this, people need to hear this. And I was
Yeah.
like, do you want to hit record again? And you were like, okay. So I just want to thank you for being willing to come back on here and us record this, which is probably a second episode
This
now.
is, yes, definitely probably a second episode.
But I feel like it did need to be heard. And I'm so glad that you were willing to have the conversation, because I am hopeful that a lot of people will hear this, and we all have an opportunity to lean in and make a bigger difference.
And I love you and adore you. And I am so thankful for your leadership. Thank you for creating these spaces where we can have these conversations. It's so important. I'm glad we had it. I mean, we were having it as a side conversation, and then and then we came back and did it here. But thank you, Heather. Thank you for all you do. And thank you for how intentional you are about all you do. I appreciate it. I appreciate you.
Thank you, Kori. I appreciate you. All right, everyone. I'll leave show notes again for you to go check out Kori, go check out Kori's work. But I think more than anything, what Kori and I would love for you to do is go be courageous. Go be courageous, and let's make a difference. Thank you so much for joining me for this week's podcast. If you're watching on YouTube, give the episode a like and leave a comment below so we can keep the conversation going. Also, be sure to subscribe to the channel so you never miss a future episode or announcement. Listening on Apple, Spotify, or another podcast app, you can watch the video and join in the after show conversation by visiting hustleandflowpodcast.com.